At 3:14 in the morning, I sat in my car outside my mother-in-law's house with an evidence folder on the passenger seat, thick enough to need 2 rubber bands, and a business card in my hand from a detective I hadn't known existed a month earlier. In 6 hours, a judge was supposed to decide whether I was fit to keep raising my own children. I wasn't afraid of that hearing anymore. I was afraid for the woman asleep behind that porch light she never remembered to turn off, because by the time she woke up, everything she'd built her whole identity on protecting was going to be gone. And some small, stupid, stubborn part of me still didn't want that to be true. 6 weeks earlier, I would have told you my life was finally, blessedly boring. I want you to understand how much that word meant to me, because boring was not something I had been able to say about my life in a very long time. My name is Erin Whitfield. For 11 years, I served as a Navy Nurse Corps officer, most of that as a critical care flight nurse, moving patients off the worst days of their lives and trying to keep them alive long enough to have a next one. I made lieutenant commander. I deployed 4 times. On the last one, during a mass casualty event I still don't talk about in detail, even now, I did my job for 9 straight hours without stopping, and then I went home and could not stop shaking for the better part of a year. The media called it what it was: post-traumatic stress, service-connected, severe enough that I was medically separated 18 months later, with a folder full of paperwork and a pension that didn't come close to covering what I'd actually lost. I tell people I'm a veteran. I do not, as a rule, tell people what kind of nurse I was, or what I saw, or would still, 3 years later, can put me flat on the floor of a grocery store if a pallet jack drops wrong behind me. That part I kept for my husband, my psychiatrist, and exactly no one else, least of all my husband's family. By the time this story starts, I was working as an inventory control lead at a regional distribution warehouse outside Ridgeline, the kind of job where nobody asks where you got so good at chain of custody logs. They just notice you never let a discrepancy slide. I got up at 5, ran 2 miles before the house woke up, made lunches, checked my daughter Maya's backpack for the field trip form she always forgot, buckled my son Eli into his car seat still half asleep, and drove to a job where the worst thing that happened most days was a misscanned pallet of paper towels. I had built that boring, ordinary life very deliberately, the way you build a splint. It wasn't decoration, it was load-bearing. I didn't know yet that in 6 weeks, every piece of that discipline would be entered into evidence as proof I couldn't be trusted with my own kids. My husband Dan is a construction project manager, steady and easy in a way I used to think meant safe, and would later learn meant something closer to conflict avoidant, which are not always the same thing, though for years I let myself believe they were. He kissed the top of my head on his way out the door every morning and told me I was doing too much before 6 a.m. His mother, Marion, had a different word for it. Most mornings, Dan stumbled into the kitchen around 6, hair every direction, and found me already dressed, with 2 lunches packed and a load of laundry going. "You've done half the day already," he'd mumble into his coffee. "Somebody has to," I'd say, and he'd kiss the top of my head, like it was a habit older than our marriage, which by then it basically was. It wasn't romance exactly. It was closer to the rhythm 2 people build when they've decided, without ever saying it out loud, that they're going to keep choosing each other on the boring days, not just the good ones. At the warehouse, I ran inventory reconciliation for a facility that moved close to 4,000 pallets a week, which meant my job, in practice, was noticing the one line in 100 that didn't add up. 6 months before any of this started, I caught a vendor billing us for freight weight on pallets that hadn't actually shipped that week, a small enough discrepancy that 2 people above me had already signed off on the invoice without blinking. My manager, Denise, called it my allergy to sloppy numbers. The Navy called it something closer to a formal violation if you let it slide on a controlled substance custody log. Either way, it meant I had spent most of my adult life training the specific, unglamorous skill of looking at a page full of numbers that were supposed to be boring and noticing immediately when one of them was lying. Marion Whitfield had been a widow for 2 years. Her husband, Colonel Harold Whitfield, a career service member Dan and his sister had worshipped their whole lives, had died of a stroke 18 months before any of this started. He left behind a modest but paid-off house, a decorated uniform in a shadow box, and something called the Harold Whitfield Veterans Assistance Trust, a private family fund he'd set up in his last 2 years, using his pension, survivor benefit, and part of his life insurance, meant to give small emergency stipends to veterans in the county who'd fallen through the cracks, rent when a disability check was late, a used car when a bus route got cut. Small, real, unglamorous help. I want to be honest about something. I liked Colonel Whitfield. He was the only person in that family who ever asked me real questions about my service, instead of treating it like a story he'd already decided the ending to. 2 months before he died, sitting on his back porch, he told me he was naming me a co-trustee of the fund, alongside Marion and his daughter Paige. I laughed and asked why. "Because you're the only one in this family who reads the fine print," he said. "Everybody else signs where I point. You ask what the paper actually says first." "Marion won't like it," I told him, because it was true, and because I didn't want to be the reason for another quiet fight in that house. He waved a hand, the same dismissive wave his daughter would inherit almost exactly. "Marion likes things easy," he said. "You don't. That's the whole point." I asked him, half joking, if he was sure he had the right daughter-in-law in mind. He wasn't joking back. "I watched you read our whole homeowner's policy line by line before you'd let Danny sign off on storm damage to this roof," he said. "Most people in this family sign where I point and never once ask what the paper actually says. I need at least one person on that list who will." I thought it was a kind, slightly odd thing for a dying man to say to his daughter-in-law. I did not understand for a long time that it was the most important sentence anyone in that family would ever say to me. Marion never activated my trustee status after he died. Every time I asked, it was still being processed with the attorney, or such a headache right now with the grief, or eventually just a change of subject, so smooth I almost didn't notice it happening 3 separate times. I let it go. I had 2 small kids, a new civilian job, and a mother-in-law who had made it clear in 1,000 small ways over 8 years that my presence in her family was tolerated rather than wanted. Chasing a piece of paper that made her uncomfortable felt like the last hill I had energy to fight for. Paige, my sister-in-law, was the golden one, younger than Dan by 4 years, effortlessly likable, always the one who organized the family Christmas card and remembered everyone's birthday and posted the sweetest captions about her father's memory and his fund. "Daddy would be so proud of what we're building," she wrote under a photo of a check being handed to some veteran I'd never met at some ceremony I was never told about. I used to feel a small, ugly twinge of jealousy at how easy she made belonging look. I did not yet understand how little I actually knew about any of them. I think about one dinner in particular more than the others. At Maya's 4th birthday, Marion arrived 40 minutes late, handed over a card with no gift inside, because experiences matter more than things. And when Maya blew out her candles, watched her do it and said, "Well, at least somebody in this family still gets excited about small things." I have turned that sentence over in my head more times than I can count since. It wasn't loud. It just happened to land exactly where it would do the most damage, the way all of her best-aimed sentences did. Marion had her own particular way of making you feel small without ever raising her voice. She'd look at the dark circles under my eyes, the kind you get from a nervous system that startles awake at 2 a.m. for no reason a civilian could name, and say, "You know, Erin, some women find they're just not built for this much stress at once. Marriage, the children, and whatever it is you're still working through." She said the word whatever like it was a diagnosis she was too polite to name out loud. Once, at Thanksgiving, when Eli dropped a pan lid and I flinched hard enough to knock over my water glass, she didn't say anything at all. She just looked at Dan across the table, one long, meaningful look, and hummed. That hum did more work than a sentence ever could have. I told myself, the way you tell yourself things to survive a family dinner, that I could outperform her doubt. If I never flinched where she could see it, if the house was clean and the kids' teeth were brushed, and I answered 3 warehouse emails before anyone else was awake, eventually the story she was quietly building about me, unstable, unpredictable, a liability wearing a mother's face, would simply run out of material. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about almost everything that summer, actually, except the one thing that mattered most, which was that I still, underneath 11 years of training myself not to trust my own alarm bells, knew how to read a room for danger. I just hadn't yet turned that instrument toward my own family. By the time any of this started, I had spent 3 years building the kind of quiet infrastructure that makes an invisible condition survivable. A psychiatrist I saw twice a month, a grounding routine I could run in under 90 seconds without anyone in the room necessarily noticing I was running it at all, naming 5 things I could see, 4 I could touch, counting my breath out on a 4-second hold. Dan knew all of it. He knew which specific sounds tended to be the worst. Sudden metallic bangs more than a raised voice, always harder in the evening than the morning. And he'd developed a habit, so quiet I don't think he fully realized he was doing it, of positioning himself slightly between me and any open door before a fireworks display started.
The way you'd stand between someone and a ledge without ever mentioning the ledge out loud. My children had grown up with a mother who sometimes needed 30 seconds to come back to a room. They had never once, not a single time, been afraid of me because of it. That detail matters more to this story than almost anything else in it.
The 4th of July barbecue at Marion's house was supposed to be small. It became the day everything I thought I understood about my in-laws came apart, and it started, absurdly, with a transformer. A utility transformer 2 streets over blew with a sound like a car crash and a rifle shot stacked on top of each other, loud enough that 3 separate neighbors called it in as gunfire. I was standing by the fence with Eli on my hip when it happened. I don't remember the next several seconds the way you remember a normal memory. I remember the ground. I remember gripping Eli hard enough that he cried out, not because I meant to hurt him, but because my hands had stopped being entirely mine for a moment. I remember a voice, but I'm told was my own, using words that had no place at a 4th of July party, calling out a formation and a direction like there was a casualty to reach. I remember Maya's voice cutting through it, high and scared, saying, "Mom?" 3 times before I heard her. It lasted, by every account I later gathered, under 11 seconds. Then I came back to myself, released Eli gently into Dan's arms, checked him over with hands that were already steady again, and apologized to my daughter. I walked myself, on my own power, to sit down against the fence with my head between my knees, doing box breathing until my heart rate came back under control. It is, clinically, a textbook example of what a trained, medicated, actively in treatment person's dissociate episode looks like when it resolves correctly. I have had worse. I have had better. That day, it was 11 seconds, and then it was over. And I checked on my son, and I apologized to my daughter. Maya, 7 years old and entirely unbothered, patted my knee and asked, in the exact bored tone she'd used to ask if we had any more juice boxes, "Is your brain doing the thing again?" "It's the thing, sweetheart," I told her. "It's almost done." She nodded and went back to her popsicle. 15 minutes later, I was helping Marion carry the potato salad back inside like nothing had happened, because that is also something 11 years of service teaches you, how to keep functioning in front of people who are watching to see if you'll fall apart. What I didn't know, standing at that fence with my head down, was that Marion had her phone out for the entire 11 seconds, and roughly 30 more on either side of it. She didn't say a word to me about it that day, not one. She hugged me goodbye at the door, told me to drive safe, and said Eli was getting so big. I drove home thinking, with something close to relief, that maybe this was the one time my worst moment had happened in front of her, and she'd simply had the decency to let it be human. 4 days later, my phone would not stop buzzing. A friend from my old unit sent it first, with no caption, just 3 question marks. Then my supervisor at the warehouse, Denise, sent it with, "Hey, just wanted you to hear this from me before someone brings it up at work. You okay?" Then it was in 3 different group chats I wasn't even in, forwarded by people who knew me. Marion had posted a 41-second clip to the Ridgeline Family Network, a local Facebook group with just under 6,000 members, most of them parents, most of them people whose opinion of me I had never once had reason to worry about before that morning. The caption read, "I love my daughter-in-law. I want to say that first. But I've watched something happening for a while now that scares me, and after the 4th of July, I can't stay quiet anymore. This is what it looks like when Erin checks out around my grandchildren. It's happened before. I don't think she even knows she's doing it. A mother needs to be present, not somewhere else in her head where the children can't reach her. I'm not trying to hurt anyone. I'm trying to protect 2 babies I love more than my own life." The clip started exactly where I hit the ground. It ended exactly where I stopped talking. It did not include Eli laughing 4 minutes later on my hip while I fed him watermelon. It did not include Maya sitting next to me against the fence, unafraid, patting my knee the way she'd been taught to since she was old enough to understand that sometimes mommy's brain needed a minute, the way you'd wait out a headache. It did not include the 15 minutes after, carrying the potato salad, laughing at one of Dan's terrible jokes. It was 41 seconds, cut with a precision that I would later learn takes actual, deliberate editing to achieve, and it made me look like exactly what Marion had spent 8 years quietly implying I might be.
The comments were what you'd expect if you have ever had the particular experience of watching several hundred strangers decide in real time that they understand your medical history better than you do. Poor kids. I always wondered about her. Thank you for having the courage to say something. Some women just aren't wired for motherhood after what they've been through. Is anyone checking on those children right now? Someone should call someone. I sat on my bathroom floor and read every single comment, which was the single stupidest and most necessary thing I did that week. Because by the time I was done, I understood something with total clarity. This was not concern. Concern doesn't cut 15 minutes down to 41 seconds. Concern doesn't choose the exact frame where a mother looks most frightening and end there. This was constructed. Somebody had built this, the way you build a case, the way I had spent 11 years learning to build a chart nobody could argue with. Somebody had simply built mine backwards, against me. I want to tell you, Dan came home and put his fist through a wall. He didn't. He came home, saw my face, read the post over my shoulder, went very quiet, and said, "Don't respond. Not to any of it. Let me think." I mistook that quiet, the same way I'd mistake it for 2 more weeks, for the same conflict-averse shrug he'd given his mother's cruelty for the entire 8 years I'd known him. I did not yet understand that a man can go quiet because he is retreating, or quiet because he is finally, for the first time, doing math. 3 days after that, a process server found me at the warehouse loading dock during my 10 a.m. break and handed me an envelope I will remember the weight of for the rest of my life. Marion and Paige, through a family attorney I'd never heard of, had filed an emergency petition asking the family court for a temporary custody modification and a court-ordered psychological fitness evaluation, citing documented episodes of dissociative and potentially dangerous behavior around minor children, with the video attached as Exhibit A. A hearing was set for 5 weeks out, the earliest the court's docket allowed. Until then, under the terms of the emergency filing, I was permitted supervised time with my own children pending the judge's review. I read that sentence 4 times before the words rearranged themselves into something I could understand. Supervised. My children. I stood on a loading dock in a high-vis vest holding a legal document that used my own diagnosis, the one I had earned keeping other people's children alive on the worst day of their lives, as a weapon to take mine. I did not cry on that loading dock. I want to be clear about that. Not because I'm proud of some idea of toughness, but because it matters to what happened next. I did not cry. I got very, very still. The particular stillness I used to feel right before a mass casualty call came in, when your body understands there is work to do, and grief is a luxury for later. I folded the envelope in half, put it in my bag, finished my shift, and drove home, already, without fully realizing it yet, building a different kind of chart. That night, once the kids were asleep, I told Dan I needed to see a lawyer. Not for a divorce, for a defense. He said he'd already called someone that morning, a family law attorney named Renee Okafor, who specialized in cases involving veterans and first responders, someone a buddy of his from a coaching league had used. I looked at my husband and understood, for the first time in 3 days, that his silence had not been retreat. It had been him building something quietly of his own, the way he did everything, without a single word until it was ready to be useful. Renee Okafor's office smelled like coffee and old carpet, and she read the petition twice before she said anything at all, which I appreciated more than I can explain. "This isn't a strong filing on the merits," she finally said. "A single documented episode, resolving within seconds, with no injury and immediate appropriate self-management, is not, on its own, grounds for an emergency custody modification in this state. What worries me is the video, because judges are human,
and 41 seconds of a mother on the ground with a child in her arms is a hard thing to unsee, whatever the full context turns out to be. She looked at me over her glasses. Do you have any reason to believe your mother-in-law has a motive here beyond concern? Because petitions like this don't usually come out of nowhere. They come out of fear or leverage or both. I told her I didn't know, which was the truth, and something about saying it out loud made me feel, for the first time since the loading dock, less like a woman defending her fitness and more like an investigator missing a piece of a case. Renee must have heard something shift in my voice because she leaned back and said, not unkindly, "You're a veteran. You've built cases before, or been part of building them, even if it wasn't this kind." I told her I'd spent 11 years learning how to document things precisely because sloppy documentation gets people hurt or gets the wrong story believed. Then use that, she said. I can win you the custody piece on the merits alone, probably. But if there's something underneath this, something that explains why a grieving widow would risk her own credibility to discredit you specifically, I'd rather we find it before the hearing than get blindsided by it during one.
I didn't have an answer for her that day. I had one within 11 days, and it did not come from where I expected it to.
It came first from an unopened stack of mail. Back in June, weeks before any of this started, Dan had been asked to help his mother move some boxes out of the garage into a storage unit before the county inspector comes about the gutters, she'd said, a detail neither of us thought twice about at the time. Buried in one of those boxes, under a stack of old holiday cards, was a padlocked accordion file with Whitfield Trust written on masking tape across the front in Colonel Whitfield's own handwriting. Dan hadn't opened it. He'd simply, out of the same instinct that made him quietly call a lawyer before I even asked, taken a photo of it and put it back exactly where he found it, because something about a locked file with his father's handwriting on it, tucked under Christmas cards in a garage his mother wanted emptied fast, didn't sit right with him. He showed me the photo that night. I looked at it for a long time. Then I did the thing that 11 years of Navy accountability training had built into me at a level deeper than conscious thought. I asked, formally, in writing, to see it. As a named co-trustee under Colonel Whitfield's original trust documents, never formally removed, only as Marion had put it for 2 years, still being processed, I had a legal right under state trust law to request a full accounting of the fund's finances. Renee filed the request the next morning, certified mail. A simple demand for 16 months of bank statements, disbursement records, and board meeting minutes for the Harold Whitfield Veterans Assistance Trust. Marion let the full 10 business days the letter allowed run out before she answered it all, and when she finally did, it wasn't an accounting. It was 4 pages of hand-summarized totals with no bank statements attached, and a note that read, in full, "I'm disappointed you'd involve lawyers in something so personal. Your father-in-law would be heartbroken." Renee read it once and set it down. "That's not an accounting," she said. "That's a stall. People who have nothing to hide send you a bank statement. People who have something to hide send you a feeling." The 5 weeks between the petition and the hearing were the hardest of my life, and I say that as someone who has some genuine competition for that title. Twice a week, a court-appointed caseworker named Miss Alvarez sat at our kitchen table for 2 hours while I made dinner, helped with homework, and read Eli his bedtime story, taking notes I was never allowed to see. I want to tell you I handled that with the same composure I trained into every other hard thing in my life. Some days I did. Some days I stood in the pantry with the door mostly closed, doing box breathing over a box of macaroni, because the particular horror of being professionally observed for signs of unfitness while parenting your own children in your own kitchen is not a thing 11 years of service prepares you for, no matter how many worse things it does prepare you for. Maya asked me once, very matter of fact, why the lady with the clipboard kept coming over. I told her the truth, sized down to something a 7-year-old had told. Some grown-ups had said something untrue about Mommy, and Miss Alvarez's job was to come see for herself that it wasn't true. Maya considered this with the total seriousness only a 7-year-old can bring to injustice, and said, "That's a dumb job if she can just ask me." I have never agreed with anyone more completely in my life. I called an old friend from my last deployment, a courseman named Teresa Nguyen who'd gotten out 2 years before me and now ran a support line for veteran families in another state, somewhere around day 9, and told her I didn't know if I could keep doing this without becoming exactly the person Marion's video said I already was. Teresa didn't tell me I was strong, or that everything happens for a reason. The 2 sentences I had privately promised myself I would scream if one more person offered them to me that week. She asked me one question instead. Is there a single documented professional in your entire chart who says you are a danger to your kids? There wasn't. Not one in 3 years of records. Then you're not fighting a medical case, she said. You're fighting a story. And you, of all people, know exactly how to take a story apart and show people what's actually underneath it. I hung up the phone, and for the first time since the process server found me on that loading dock, I stopped feeling like a woman waiting to be judged and started feeling like an investigator with a case to build. I want to tell you the rest of this unraveled through some dramatic break-in, some late-night raid of my own. It didn't. It unraveled the way most true things do. Slowly. Through paperwork. Through a formal legal demand I had every right to make. And through one accidental, half-drunk sentence at a family function neither Marion nor Paige ever should have let me anywhere near. It was Dan's birthday the following week, 9 days after he'd first shown me that photo of the locked file. Paige came because Paige always came, bright and warm and generous with everyone in the room, except, I now understood, the truth. She'd had 2 glasses of wine by the time she sat next to me on the porch steps, and she said, apropos of nothing, laughing, God, I needed this week to be over. Overwatch has been such a headache lately. I swear, running that whole thing basically by myself. I asked, as casually as I could manage with my pulse suddenly loud in my ears, what Overwatch was. She waved a hand. Oh, it's nothing. It's just a retreat thing for the veterans in the fund. Wellness stuff. It's really more Mom's project than mine. I just help with the books. Then Dan called everyone in for cake, and the moment passed, and Paige never mentioned it again, and she had absolutely no idea what she had just handed me. I have spent 11 years learning to notice the sentence someone says too casually about the thing they most want you not to look at. Overwatch wellness retreats. I typed it into the state business registry search on my phone before I'd even finished my slice of cake. It existed. Barely. Overwatch Wellness Retreats, LLC. Registered 16 months earlier, the same month, I would later confirm, as the first suspicious disbursement, to a registered agent address that turned out, on a second search the next morning, to a UPS store mailbox 2 towns over. No website, no listed staff, no retreat center, cabin, facilitator, or program I could find any evidence of anywhere online, despite what would turn out to be over $100,000 flowing into it, from a fund meant to keep homeless veterans off the street. I brought all of it to Renee that same night. The LLC printout, Dan's photo of the padlocked trust file, Marion's 4-page non-answer, and by the next afternoon, she had it in front of Detective Lucia Marsh at the County Sheriff's Financial Crimes Unit, rather than waiting to build a complete picture first. You don't sit on a shell company and a stonewalled trustee for a week deciding whether it's enough, Renee told me. You hand it to someone whose entire job is deciding that. Marsh opened a case that same day. She was younger than I expected, with the specific patience of someone who has explained the phrase financial exploitation of a family charitable trust to a lot of frightened, furious relatives before us. I want to be straight with you, she said. We've had 2 other complaints touch this fund's edges in the last year. A beneficiary who thought his stipend check bounced, a former board volunteer who quit without explanation. Nobody had documentation clean enough to open a file. You do. Her office brought in a forensic accountant named Victor Nazarenko to build the complete financial trace, a quiet, precise man who spoke almost entirely in numbers and asked me exactly 2 personal questions the first time we met, both about how I preferred to receive bad news. I told him the same way I preferred to receive a patient's vitals, fast, complete, and without cushioning. He respected that for the rest of the case and warned me up front that a trace this size, done properly enough to survive a defense attorney's cross-examination, was going to take him the better part of 2 weeks, working days and most nights. It took Victor 11 days to build what he called, with the flat pride of a man who loved his work, a clean picture. He laid it out for Dan and me across 3 color-coded pages on Renee's conference table, tapping each column in order like he was briefing a room twice our size. Deposits into the trust's main account. Here, he said. Disbursements out. Here.
dated and coded by stated purpose. And here, he tapped the third page, is every dollar I can trace once it leaves the trust and lands somewhere else. He looked up at me before he kept going. I've done 18 years of this. Most family fraud is sloppy because people don't expect anyone in their own house to check. This wasn't sloppy.
Somebody staggered these withdrawals specifically to stay under the bank's automatic flagging threshold. That's not panic. That's someone who read the rules and then broke them carefully. Over 16 months, the Harold Whitfield Veterans Assistance Trust had disbursed $147,600 to Overwatch Wellness Retreats LLC in 11 separate transfers, each one authorized by Marion's signature as trust administrator and logged in the informal ledger as Veteran Wellness Programming. Of that $147,600, Victor traced roughly $131,000 of it moving within days of each deposit from the LLC's symbol business account into a personal checking account belonging to Paige Whitfield Reyes. And from there, in smaller, staggered withdrawals, designed, Victor said, the way people design withdrawals when they don't want a bank's fraud algorithm to notice, into an offshore processed online sportsbook account that Detective Lucia Marsh, once we brought the file to her, would later confirm had been sending overdue balance notices and, in the final 4 months, outright threatening messages to a phone number registered to Paige.
In the same 16 months, the fund's real program, the one Colonel Whitfield had actually built, the small emergency stipends for veterans who'd fallen through the cracks, had quietly shrunk from an average of 18 households a quarter to 6. Applications that used to be approved within a week were taking 2 months, then getting denied for insufficient current funds the winter before, now telling him there was nothing left to give.
I sat with that number for a long time. $131,000 was not an abstraction to me. It was Walter Timmons's heating bill, 11 times over. It was also, Victor's record showed, a denied application from a 26-year-old Marine veteran named Cody Reyes. No relation to Paige's married name, just a coincidence that made me sit very still the first time I read it, who'd asked for $400 toward a security deposit on a studio apartment after 3 months in a shelter, and when told in a 2-line email that the fund had no current capacity. It was every quiet, decent, ordinary version of the help Colonel Whitfield had actually meant to build, funneled instead into an account designed to disappear, a gambling debt his own daughter couldn't say out loud to anyone in her family. When Victor walked his finished numbers over to Marsh's office, she logged the full report into evidence, added it to the case she'd already opened, and told us plainly not to confront either Marion or Paige directly ourselves before her office had a chance to move on the accounts. That's the fastest way to watch $130,000 finish disappearing before anyone can freeze a cent of it, she said. We listened. It was, by then, the easiest instruction anyone had given me in a month. There was one more piece, and it came from a woman I'd met exactly once, for maybe 4 minutes, at that same 4th of July barbecue. Holly Jensen was a neighbor of Marion's, a retired school teacher who'd known the family for years and had been standing near the far side of the yard on the 4th, filming her own grandkids on the trampoline when the transformer blew. Her camera, aimed at children jumping, had caught the entire yard in the background for just over 3 minutes. My episode, my recovery, Maya's hand on my knee, Eli laughing on my hip with watermelon on his chin 15 minutes later. All of it, wide and unedited and utterly unremarkable, except for the 11 seconds in the middle that any parent watching would recognize as a hard human moment, quickly and competently handled. Renee found her through the neighborhood group itself, in a comment thread where Holly had quietly written, under Marion's viral post, "I was standing right there, and this isn't the whole story," a comment that had gotten 9 angry replies and no real attention before Marion deleted it. Holly gave a sworn statement without hesitation and handed over the original file. Devika Rao, a digital forensics examiner Renee brought in to formally verify it, confirmed what was by then obvious. Marion's posted clip had been trimmed from a source video 3 minutes and 12 seconds long, down to 41 seconds, with the cut points chosen in Devika's clinical language to exclude all footage depicting appropriate self-regulation, child reassurance, and full recovery of parental function. In plain English, someone had watched the whole thing, understood exactly what it proved, and cut every part that proved it before uploading what was left. I met Holly Jensen for coffee once, weeks after her sworn statement.
mostly because I needed to say thank you to her face and not just through Renee's office. She was embarrassed by the attention, kept saying she'd only done what anybody decent would do, and I told her, honestly, that decent is exactly the thing most people quietly decide not to be when it might cost them a friendship with someone like Marion. She asked how the kids were doing. I told her they were doing better than I was, which was true, and which is, I've come to think, one of the strange mercies of small children. They mostly just want to know if mommy's brain is doing the thing, and once you tell them it's almost done, they go back to their popsicle and trust you completely. I wished, not for the first time, that the 6,000 strangers in that Facebook group had been half as easy to convince.
I confess that when Renee laid Holly's affidavit and Davika's report on the table next to Victor's financial trace, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel, which was less like triumph and more like grief. Because now I understood the shape of the whole thing at once. The way you understand a diagnosis the moment the last lab result comes back and confirms what you'd been afraid of the whole time. Marion hadn't filmed me out of concern that curdled into cruelty. She had filmed me and waited and chosen her 41 seconds because I was a named trustee who had started, quietly, asking for an accounting she could not afford to give. And the fastest way to make sure nobody ever took my questions seriously was to make the whole county believe I was the one who couldn't be trusted. I still don't know, and Detective Marsh told me I probably never fully will, how much Marion understood about where the money was actually going, versus how much she simply chose for 2 years not to ask. What I do know, because bank records don't lie the way people do, is that 14 months before any of this started, Marion had taken out a $150,000 home equity line of credit on the house she'd owned outright for over 20 years. Victor traced the timing precisely. The HELOC had opened 9 days after Paige first came to her in tears, according to a single voicemail Paige had never deleted from Marion's own phone, an old message Davika recovered from a cloud backup, saying only, "Mom, I need you. These people are calling the house now. I don't know what they'll do. Please, I can't tell Danny." Marion had not asked for details. She had simply gone to the bank the following week and borrowed against the only thing she owned outright, just to make a debt collector stop calling her daughter. That wasn't enough. Paige kept losing faster than one loan could cover, so Marion went looking for a bigger, quieter source, and found the fund her husband had built for strangers, sitting right there, already trusted, already under her signature. It did not excuse what she did to me. I want to be completely clear about that, because I spent one long night lying awake trying to talk myself into excusing it, and I couldn't, and I stopped trying. Fear for your daughter does not require destroying your daughter-in-law's credibility as collateral. Marion had other choices. She had Renee's letter sitting on her kitchen counter for 3 weeks and chose, instead of answering it honestly, to build a case against my mind instead of answering for the money. That was a decision made with a clear head by a woman who had raised a decorated officer's children and knew exactly what she was doing when she cut a video down to 41 seconds. Understanding her fear didn't erase her choice. It just meant that when the consequences came, I didn't feel like a soldier walking into a fight. I felt like a nurse walking into a room where the damage had already been done long before I got there, and all that was left to do now was make sure nobody else got hurt by it again. The HELOC, by the time Victor finished tracing it, told its own quiet countdown. Marion had missed 3 of the last 4 monthly payments, $681 each, using the fund's disbursements to Paige, a slice of which Paige quietly wired back to her every month as help with Dad's bills, as an indirect bridge that had finally run dry the same month the video went viral. Because the moment Renee's accounting letter arrived, Marion had frozen the disbursements herself, panicking, trying to make the paper trail stop moving before anyone could follow it, which meant the very money that had been keeping her own house's minimum payments afloat had dried up at exactly the moment she needed it least. $2,043 past due. A cure notice from the bank sitting, I would learn, unopened in the same kind of stack where the trust file had been hidden, giving her until the end of that month before the account moved toward default. The custody hearing was set for a Thursday. The bank's cure deadline, we realized with the particular cold clarity of 2 people staring at 2 separate calendars at midnight, fell the following Monday. Detective Marsh, once she saw both dates side by side, made a decision of her own. If we wait for the custody hearing to play out first, she said, and then move on the fraud case after, Marion has 4 extra days to keep making calls, moving whatever's left, coaching Paige's story. I'd rather not give her those 4 days. She applied for search warrants on the Overwatch LLC's bank records and Paige's personal accounts to be executed the same morning as the custody hearing.
Renee filed an emergency motion of our own, attaching Holly's sworn statement, Devika's forensic report on the edited video, and a formal notice that the trust's finances were under active law enforcement investigation, and asked the judge to consider all of it before the hearing even opened.
Which brings me back to 3:14 in the morning, sitting in my car outside a house I had been welcomed into 1,000 ordinary times, holding a folder I never wanted to need, and a detective's card I never wanted to have a reason to call. I hadn't driven there to confront anyone. Renee had told me, in the same flat, kind voice she used for every hard thing, not to. I'd driven there because I couldn't sleep, and some part of me, the part that used to sit with families in the worst hour of their lives, needed to be near it when it happened, instead of hearing about it secondhand over coffee the next morning. I watched that porch light Marion never remembered to turn off, and I thought about Colonel Whitfield telling me I was the one who read the fine print, and I understood, sitting there in the dark, that he had been right about me in a way none of us could have predicted the day he said it. I had read the fine print. It had cost his family everything they'd built their comfort on, pretending not to see. The hearing that Thursday lasted 11 minutes. Renee opened with Holly's affidavit and Devika's forensic timeline, laid out plainly. The video entered as Exhibit A had been deliberately edited to remove all evidence of appropriate parental function and recovery, submitted by a petitioner who was, as of that morning, named in an active state financial crimes investigation involving the very trust my client had been formally requesting an accounting from at the time the video was posted. The judge, a woman who had clearly sat through a great many custody filings built on far less and far messier motives than concern, asked Marion's attorney a single question. Did his client wish to respond to the forensic finding regarding the video's editing? Marion's attorney asked for a recess to confer with his client. He returned 9 minutes later and withdrew the petition. There was no dramatic collapse in the courtroom, no scene, no shouting. Marion sat very still in a blazer she'd clearly chosen carefully that morning and did not look at me once. I did not feel triumphant. I felt mostly tired and something close to sad, in the specific, useless way you feel sad watching a slow-motion accident you know you cannot stop and were never responsible for causing. The search warrants executed that same morning. Paige was arrested 11 days later, once Victor's trace and Marcia's records were complete, on charges of embezzlement from a charitable trust and wire fraud. Renee was there for the arraignment. She told me Paige cried through most of it, the same easy tears she'd once cried over her father's memory in 100 Facebook captions. Paige pleaded guilty 4 months later to a reduced set of charges, was ordered to pay full restitution, a debt Renee said she'd likely spend a decade paying down, and received a suspended sentence with no jail time, a resolution I've made peace with not fully resolving. Whether she ever stopped gambling, I've stopped needing to know. Marion's home equity line of credit went into default the following month, once the trust's frozen accounts cut off the money that had secretly been sustaining her payments. The bank moved toward foreclosure on its own indifferent schedule. 6 months after that Thursday in court, Marion sold the house at a loss after 22 years of owning it outright and moved into a 1-bedroom apartment across town. She didn't call to tell us. Dan heard it from a cousin. He called her once the week the sale closed, the first of only 2 brief, necessary conversations he's had with his mother since. He asked her, simply, why she hadn't just told the truth from the beginning and let the family actually help, instead of building a case against his wife's mind to buy herself time. Her answer was 6 words. I was trying to protect this family. He sat with that for a moment. You didn't protect us, he told her. You just decided which one of us was disposable, and it wasn't you. She had nothing to say back. There has been no apology since, not the kind with an admission attached, and I stopped waiting for one somewhere around the 4th month. Renee helped us formally petition the court to remove Marion from the trust and finally activate the trustee status Colonel Whitfield had assigned me 2 years earlier. With Victor's help, we rebuilt the funds books from scratch, published them to a board that now includes a local veteran services nonprofit, and reopened applications. Walter Timmons was the second stipend we approved. As of this month, the fund supports 31 households, more than it ever did under the version nobody was allowed to look at closely. Some Sundays now, I drive out to the cemetery where Colonel Whitfield is buried, usually alone, sometimes with Maya, who likes to help me clear leaves off the brass plaque with his name and the branch he served. I don't talk to a headstone the way people do in movies. I mostly just stand there and think about a man who spent his last 2 years trying to build something decent, and how close his own family came to finishing the exact opposite. I think he would have hated a great deal about how this played out. I think underneath that, he would have been relieved that someone finally read the fine print all the way to the end. I never posted anything about any of this, not to the Ridgeline Family Network, not anywhere. I didn't need to. A local reporter, Marcus Webb, ran a piece 3 months later on a pattern of small-scale charitable fund fraud in the county, quoting Detective Marsh without ever naming Marion or Paige. The plea agreement kept those details sealed. He didn't need to name them. Enough people in that 6,000-member group had by then heard enough of the real story to understand exactly what they cheered for and exactly whose family it had happened to. Dan changed in ways I am still, honestly, learning to trust completely. Not as a complaint, but as the truth of what real repair looks like. Slow, unglamorous, and proven only in small moments rather than one grand gesture. He tells our children the truth about my service in age-appropriate pieces now, without shame in his voice, the way I always wished someone in his family would from the beginning. When Eli asked me months later why Grandma Marion doesn't come over anymore, I told him the truest, simple version I had, that Grandma made some very serious choices that hurt people, including me, and that choices like that have consequences, even for grown-ups, even for people we love. He accepted that the way small children accept most hard truths, with a nod and a request for a snack, and I have never once regretted telling him honestly, instead of protecting him from a softer lie. I stopped hiding my diagnosis after that Thursday in court. It's a strange kind of freedom, to have your worst 11 seconds used as a weapon against you in public, survive it, and stop being willing to keep the rest of it secret out of shame. I speak now, when it's useful, at a peer support group for military spouses and veterans through the same county office we partnered with to rebuild the trust, using the clinical vocabulary Marion once weaponized as a slur, without ever learning what it actually meant. I think about Colonel Whitfield more than I expected to, especially on quiet mornings when I sit down to review the fund's disbursements, the actual ones, going to actual people, the way he meant them to. I read the fine print. It's what he trusted me to do, in a family that mostly preferred not to look too closely at anything. I did it for his memory, for Walter Timmons' heating bill, and, in the end, for 2 kids who deserve to grow up knowing that the version of their mother the internet understood in 41 edited seconds was never, not for 1 single second, the whole story. If any part of this sounded familiar to you, if you've worn a uniform or loved someone who did, and had your hardest days used against you by people who were supposed to protect you instead, I want you to hear this clearly. An 11-second moment of your nervous system doing exactly what years of training and treatment taught it to do is not evidence of who you are. It's evidence of what you survived. Tell me in the comments where you're watching this from tonight, and if you've lived any version of this story yourself, you're not alone in this room. If this one needed to be said, stay for the next one. There's always another family out there still hiding the fine print somebody needs to finally read.